Hi, everyone. Let's conclude today's lecture by looking at one final phenomenon of relevance for phonemic analysis, namely so-called cases of contextually limited contrast. Let's first briefly define this term. So I will say that two sounds exhibit so-called contextually limited contrast if they are contrastive in some phonological contexts, namely we can find some instances of those two sounds occurring in identical environments, just as we've done repeatedly in our analyses in attempting to establish that two sounds are indeed contrastive. But when we find that the sounds are actually not contrastive in some other contexts, namely only one of the sounds or maybe even some other sound altogether occurs in those contexts. If you have some other sound altogether, that would be an instance in which we have some phonological process applying to both of those underlyingly contrastive sounds and transforming them into some third sound under other conditions. The data that we'll be looking at comes from the language Ayinika Apurikayali, which is a language indigenous to Peru. And we have what we're going to be looking at are the labial and coronal nasals in this language. I'm not going to carry out a systematic phonemic analysis for these two sounds, but only going to briefly look at the data. So what we should notice here is that in general, we find these sounds, these nasals, occurring freely, these two different nasals occurring before vowels. So we can find words like mapi, rock, here it is, and ana, black dye, here, in which we have the labial nasal occurring before an a vowel and the coronal nasal occurring before an a vowel. And systematically between vowels or before a vowel at the beginning of a word, either of these nasals is allowed to occur. One note on the phonotactics of this language, it appears that consonants are not allowed to occur at the end of a word. So you'll notice that all of the words in the data here have a vowel as the final segment. If we find instances of nasals preceding consonants, what we'll notice there, however, is that the nasal has to have the same place of articulation as a following consonant. So in the word for pond frog, for instance, there we have a nasal occurring before an alveolar nasal occurring before an alveolar stop. So those two sounds share a place of articulation. And in the word he will come, impoki, there we have a labial nasal occurring before a labial stop. So in such cases, it's not entirely clear what the underlying representation for the nasal ought to be. What is clear is that the language excludes sequences of, say, a labial nasal followed by a alveolar stop, or a alveolar nasal followed by a labial stop. Those sequences of sounds can't occur in the language. For the underlying representations of a word like pond frog, let's assume I'll use a capital N here to represent any possible nasal because it's not clear to us what the underlying representation should be, because the phonology of this language, of Ayininka Apurukayali, is going to force this nasal to have alveolar place of articulation due to the place of articulation of the following stop in this case. This means that we're dealing with a case of contextually limited contrast. As we said, nasals do contrast before vowels. Either a labial or a coronal nasal can occur before a vowel, but preceding at least a non-sonorant sound, like a stop. And we can also, I think there's some instances, yes, before the affricate "sa" in the data, as in the word for friend, we only find a coronal nasal, as we would expect. Um, so this means that we have a process, regardless of whether we said that this word had an underlying labial nasal or an underlying coronal nasal, or as I had written before, a nasal without place features. A process like the process of nasal assimilation given in 17 would ensure that we find the correct forms, pirinto and impoki, on the surface. This nasal assimilation rule states that whenever you have a nasal sound, it needs to adopt the place features. I'm writing this assimilation rule in a rather simplified form. At present, I'm using the subscript of the letter I to indicate whatever place feature that is, say alveolar or labial or velar. And that assimilation of place features will occur when the nasal precedes a non-sonorant consonant, as before a stop ta or a stop pa. So this means nasals, our point overall here is then that nasals cannot be contrastive. We cannot find the difference between labial and alveolar nasals when there is a following non-sonorant consonant. Then on the theme of the psychological reality of the phoneme, in one of the works from which the data on this language come, there's an interesting anecdote, an interesting little story about the development of an orthography for this language, which tells us something more about the psychological reality of these phonemes. So one of the consultants on this language, with whom Payne, Doris Payne, was working on this, doing field work for this language, he, Mr. Sanchez here, he was a native speaker of this language, and he already was literate in Spanish as well. And he was trying to learn the writing system that Payne was developing for the Ayinenca language. And Payne here writes that Jorge, Mr. Sanchez, was first taught to write the alveolar nasal, the N sign, the letter N, before a T whenever it occurred, as in the word for pond frog, pirinto. And he was also taught to write M and N, as in the words for rock and black dye. But whenever he wrote a nasal before P, before the phoneme P, which would have been consistently represented with the orthographic sign of the letter P, he wrote it with an N instead of with an N. So for instance, he wrote for impoki, he used the N sign rather than N sign, rather than M sign. And finally, when he was later taught to write an M, the M sign before P, as is consistently done in Spanish, he changed to consistently writing the M sign for T as well. So at that point, he began to write pirin with an M sign, the word for pond frog. So if we try to look at things then from the perspective of Mr. Sanchez, how can we explain that he felt that the spelling system ought to use the same letter in these words, pirinto and impoki? I think it's precisely because of this phenomenon of contextually limited contrast. And this maybe precisely suggests to us that for Mr. Sanchez, all of these words in which there is a nasal preceding a non-sonorant consonant, that they all have the same underlying phoneme, which will be derived through the application of a nasal assimilation rule. And again, we have the difficult problem that we're not exactly sure how that phoneme should be represented. It's clear that the language has a labial nasal phoneme and an alveolar labial, an alveolar nasal phoneme. But for those words, pond frog, pirinto, and he will come, impoki, evidently, Mr. Sanchez believed that those words contain the same nasal phoneme, and since they contain the same nasal phoneme, he reasonably believed that he should use the same orthographic symbol to represent that nasal phoneme, and evidently it didn't matter to him whether we used one sign or the other sign that was being used for contrastive nasal phonemes in the language. Okay, so let's briefly summarize the main points from today's lecture. So first, as we saw after we reviewed the ORDOM analysis, is that the more you actually work on trying to analyze phonological systems, the easier it becomes, because you will encounter phenomena across languages that are very similar. So this was the case for processes of affrication of alveolar stops. And when we compared the phonemic systems of labial sounds in Spanish and Garifuna, there we found that languages could have some identical phones. So Spanish and Garifuna both had a voiced bilabial stop, but a bilabial fricative va and a labiovelar glide wa, but the phonemic and allophonic distribution of those phones was slightly different. In that particular case, we found that both Spanish and Garifuna should be analyzed as having an underlying labial stop phoneme and an underlying labiovelar glide phoneme wa, but the bilabial fricative va belonged to different phonemes in those two languages. Finally, we've discussed in some detail reasons to believe that these phonemes that we are discovering through our analyses indeed have psychological reality, that native speakers of languages that we analyze can be thought to have the very same contrastive sounds that our analytical procedures will posit to be contrastive. And our last 2 points were simply that we sometimes need to be aware of possible interactions between rules that can result from writing fewer rules. Very often, if you try to write the most specific rules possible, you may be able to avoid the problem of rule interaction, but that won't make for a very satisfying analysis. And our last point was simply that we can find cases where two sounds in a language may indeed be contrastive and phonemic. This is the case for nasals in the Ayininka Apuracayali language, but they don't have to be contrasted in all phonological environments of a language. At some point in this course, we will come to discussing the phenomenon of devoicing of voiced stops in German, so-called Auslautverhärtung, and there we'll see that this same notion of contextually limited contrast is at play. Okay, thanks everyone for your attention. I hope that you found today's lecture helpful. And for those of you enrolled in this course at the LMU, we'll see each other in the exercise session on Wednesday. All right, take care everyone.